In chapters 15 and 16 in Farewell to Manzanar, Jean continues this theme of separateness and fractured in her family, and you really start to see the people going their separate ways and living separate lives, and the family unit really breaking down. And as we see in the beginning of chapter 15, she talks about her separateness, and as a foreshadowing, she also says her family had begun to dwindle, as well as the people in the camp. They're starting to take advantage of the relocation plans, and they're getting out. And it's 1944 by now, and there's only 6,000 people remaining in camp. People are leaving, and so there's this feeling of fracturedness and isolation, separateness that she's talking about. And she talks about her family, even her family members are leaving. And, people are, the Issei are not wanting to leave just yet. The Nisei do, second generation Nisei, they do want to leave. They're ready to get out. They want to start a new life outside. And the people who are staying behind are the aging and the young. And you can imagine why. You can imagine that they're getting more used to life. They're getting more familiar. They're getting older, and they don't want to start anew. And in fact, later on in chapter 16, we'll see that those are the reasons why Papa doesn't want to leave and move to another state as they begin leaving. And we see that Woody then leaves to the war. He gets drafted in 1944, and Papa, they're having this conversation about whether he should go or not, and Papa's rightfully he's worried. He's thinking, hey, what if he just refused? And question number 2 is interesting because you might have missed it, but in chapter 3, Jean talks about her brother Woody's life after the war and how he became a pro wrestler and traveled the nation. And so we know, as a reader, we know everything will be okay, but they don't know that at the time. And Papa refers to Tom Doboshi, or Dobashi, sorry, I think it's spelled incorrectly, should change that. Tom Dobashi, who was imprisoned, as Woody points out, for refusing to go, but Papa says he was already in jail. And it takes Woody to understand that a little bit, but they're talking about the camp and how they're already in prison. And that's going to become an important factor, especially in chapter 16, as the merit of the camp and the internment gets into question. And so seeing Woody leave for Jean, as it says on page 111, was like watching Papa leave again. And there's this sorrow as he leaves. And she's like, nothing could happen to Woody. And so, Woody is similar to his father because he's relentless. He's hardworking. He goes where he has to in order to get the job done. And he becomes part of the 442nd Combat Regiment, and he shows his loyalty right here on the bottom. Woody was that kind of Nisei, anxious to prove to the world his loyalty. Didn't Papa have that kind of similar attitude to prove something about himself? And so Woody has that as well. And he wanted to prove his manhood, something about his family honor. And so you can imagine, Mama's not feeling that way, though, feeling very, very sad. And Jean ends with the chapter with this idea of separateness again. Families were being torn asunder. And so we go to chapter 16, titled Free to Go. And we are introduced to 3 cases. And so if you look at question number 2, there are 3 cases. One, Gordon Hirabayashi, who was a Nisei student who challenged the evacuation order, and he challenged the racial bias. He talked about the civil rights that were being abused, and they were just told, the courts just told them wartime necessity. Man, that's how crazy to be told that your violation of civil rights is a wartime necessity. The second challenge was to the exclusion order from Fred Korematsu, who was a young Nisei living in Oakland, and he ignored the order to stay with his Caucasian girlfriend. Interesting. That's crazy, and this is part of question number one as well. He had plastic surgery done to his face. He changed his name and was posing as a Spanish Hawaiian when the FBI caught up with him. How crazy! Federal money, federal agencies trying to weed out Japanese Americans. And so, and then, and the question arises: why were no German Americans evacuated or Americans of Italian descent? Don't they serve don't they pose a threat to the nation as well? And so, in this second case, Fred Korematsu, he argues that due process had been violated along with other constitutional rights, and I don't disagree. The third challenge was to the internment camps. Mitsu Endo was a 29-year-old or 21-year-old Nisei and an employee of the California State Highway Commission, and filed a petition for habeas corpus, saying that the detention was unjust. And eventually, this was the third case was the one that eventually helped free the Japanese Americans in these internment camps, because the government realized they cannot detain loyal citizens against their will. And so then they rescinded the executive order, the announcement, and they announced that the camps would close in 12 months. Can you imagine? You get used to life one way, and then you get that ripped apart, and you're now in an internment camp, and now within a year you have to move out and change all of a sudden. And so you can see on page 115 that this was hardly joyful, right? Hardly joyful. And people were weary, they were concerned, they were wondering if they should return home at all, and some didn't want to, and they wanted to, stay in Manzanar as much as possible, because there was some racism that they were realizing, and they were thinking maybe as they returned to America, they'd experience that racism. I mean, you can imagine 3 years of wartime propaganda. It said here that it turned the Japanese face into something despicable and grotesque. And if you've seen any of that World War II propaganda, you'll see that they intentionally distorted the images of Japanese soldiers in order to kind of dehumanize the enemy, right? And so you think about all these groups that were created that were so racist, like the American Legion, the Native Sons of the Golden West, and new groups being created: No Japs Incorporated, the Home Front Commandos, the Pacific Coast Japanese Problem League. That's crazy. Even some growers association, threatened by the return of interned farmers, had been using the war as a way to foment hostile feelings in the major farming areas. So you can imagine farmers were kind of harboring this racism, and there was, like as question number 3 shows, there probably is economic motive too, to keep them out so that they don't lose their jobs, they don't lose their financial gains that they had from this internment. And there's this divide of races through the camp as well. You imagine being isolated for 3 years with just Japanese people, or just people of your own kind. And you also think about society outside of Manzanar, not having to interact with Japanese people for 3 years. You can see how the racial lines were continuously divided. But they do have to go, and as they're thinking about their departure, there's all these stories of people getting assaulted, homes being burned. There was a night rider who carried shotgun and opened fire on a farmhouse near Fresno, and there's just all these stories of these targeted racisms. And she says gossip tends to thrive on bad news, not good. And question number 4 is a personal question for you. Do you see that happening? I can imagine some of us have experienced, more negative news than positive, and it's happening in society today. And the news corporations, they have a slogan. They say, if it bleeds, it leads. And so they have more of a incentive to report bad news so that they get more viewership. And so even from your own life, I'm sure you probably heard a lot more of the bad stuff than the good in other people's lives and whatnot. And so with all that, Jean's family, the Wakatsuki family, decides to stay as long as possible in Manzanar. And um, yeah, there's just those fears that permeate through them. Um, what else questions do we have? Oh, and then they talk about leaving life outside of outside of Manzanar, and the Wakatsukis are planning on what to do in the future. And for Jean, the humiliation is the thing that she's most afraid of. She's not afraid of like the physical um, racism or physical attacks, but it was more of the humiliation that she could feel. And she had that happen already at schools before, and so she's worried about that. And yeah, so it's the hostility that keeps Mama and Papa from leaving Manzanar. And a lot of the family members, the children, the first being Bill and his wife Tomi, they moved to New Jersey, all the way in the East Coast where there's less anti-Asian sentiment, and they find jobs out there and move out there. But Papa doesn't, and I want to read this part in page 119. He was too old to start over. And that was already said, it's crazy because that was said as he entered Manzanar. He was too old to work. He was too old to start over. Now he's too old to start over outside of Manzanar. He was too afraid of rejection in an unknown part of the world, too stubborn and too tired to travel that far, and finally too proud to do piecework on an assembly line. And so they're finally getting accustomed and trying to think about what life outside of Manzanar will look like. And so we'll see what that does look like in the upcoming chapters.